Hi everyone, Patricia Worby here. Happy New Year to all of you. It's time to let you know what's been going on here at Alchemy Therapies. I'm very excited to tell you I've got a new course starting next week, January the 16th, on trauma-informed practice. Now, this is for therapists, practitioners, students, and teachers, anyone in fact who works with people who have or might have trauma. And to be honest, most of us have trauma in our lives. The definition of childhood trauma is broadening all the time. We're working out that in fact it's anything that happens that overwhelms your capacity to cope. And a lot of kids are growing up with, vast amounts of pressure these days. So trauma is increasing, and the support available to help overcome this problem is decreasing. And so we are seeing more and more physical and mental ill health as a result of trauma. So you can't really afford to be non-trauma informed these days. So what's in this course? Well, I've got 4 modules. It's been made available online, so you can access it once you've signed up anytime and replay and keep replaying as often as you need to until you've got all the principles. It also includes some essential handouts and all the notes, extensive notes and slides as well, available to you. So module 1 is an introduction of trauma and its somatic components. Because basically you need to know trauma doesn't just affect the brain, it affects the body as well, the soma. And we need to understand this and know what likely symptoms will manifest from these effects. But so to introduce, I'll be looking at the definition of trauma. So PTSD all the way through to complex relational trauma. I'll then be introducing some of the principles of the approach that I use, a mind-body systems approach to health and healing, which includes things like neuroplasticity, dysautonomia, which means an unbalanced autonomic nervous system, and epigenetics, of course, because the thoughts we think, the food we eat, the air we breathe, the activities we engage in, all change the expression of our genes, and that's what epigenetics is. So module 2 develops on this a little further with the neurobiology of loss and looks at the parts of your brain, in particular the limbic system, how it functions as a survival brain. And we'll be looking at how that sort of translates into the messages of stress throughout your body. I'll then be delving into a bit more of the psychology, the attachment theory, if you've never come across that, but perhaps you have, and the misattunement and neural dysregulation that happens when children don't receive the right messages at the right time of safety and security. I'll then be looking at how memory is formed, memory consolidation, and this is really important for understanding how we can undo the effects of trauma. So we'll be looking at explicit versus implicit memory. Most trauma is implicit. It survives in a different part of the brain. It is not changed by time, unlike explicit memory, and it persists and it carries on, triggering the body throughout the lifespan. I'll be looking at that and how it lives within the body as well. So the somatic components of trauma and unresolved emotion, and why talk therapy, although very helpful, is often not enough to change the way a person feels in their body, because trauma is stored in a different way to other forms of memory, and thus talking about it doesn't really touch it, because it's a limbic system survival problem. And then module 3 is more to do with the practice of trauma-informed therapy. So here I'm getting really specific with how to engage with your clients or students or anyone, what to look for, how to collect information that might give you a clue, because often it's hidden. That's a really important thing to know. People seldom come into your practice to say, I've got childhood trauma and I need it addressing. Sometimes they do, but often they'll come in with their symptoms, and that's where you need to be more of a detective and find out what's actually going on. So in Module 3, I'll be looking at the data collection and assessment of that data and their history, what to collect, what to look for, what patterns to engage with, how childhood experience and the sensitized brain combine to form certain patterns of symptomology in the body. And we'll also be covering gender differences in this, because men and women's brains are very different, and their stress response is often very different as well. And that's something that's very seldom addressed in courses or in research. It's a vastly under-researched area, and I really wanted to engage with you here because women in particular suffer different symptomology to men, and women make up the vast majority of people with chronic illness, and there is a reason for that. I'll be looking at childhood meaning making, how the childhood brain interprets what's going on in the world and makes meaning of it, which is usually wrong, but it's adaptive for their childhood experience. But it often then carries on into their adult experience and becomes inappropriate and dysregulatory. I'll be looking at the disconnect from self, which happens as a result of trauma. A trauma isn't just the event that happened then, it's about what's going on now in the body constantly, and how the body interprets your external environment through the lens of your past experience. And it often creates this disconnect where it's too painful, it's too difficult to focus on the internal feelings, and so we avoid them. And we find other strategies like overworking, addictions, avoidance completely, becoming phobic of ourselves and our internal feelings. So we dissociate from them. I'll be introducing Polyvagal Theory, which, if you've never come across that, is a real eye-opener for people who work with trauma, because it looks at the autonomic nervous system in a very different way to the way you may have been introduced to it from school biology or a degree in physiology. Polyvagal theory states that there are 3 levels of the autonomic nervous system, not 2, and that there are 2 parasympathetic systems, and the bottom system is the really important one. It's the freeze response, and it's often been ignored in, well, just about everywhere, but it's really vital in explaining why people end up with chronic symptoms, sometimes syndromes like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, chronic anxiety states, which they simply can't get out of, or they find it very, very hard, because freeze response is the bottom layer of your nervous system when you are under overwhelming threat, and it is meant to be short term. Finally, I'll be looking at the window of tolerance and how to expand the window of tolerance. It's a lovely working model of the brain, if you like, for therapists. Basically, what we're trying to do is allow people to tolerate better their own internal experiences so they don't shut themselves down. Module 4 looks at reenactment in relationships, and it's particularly important if you're working with people that you understand this, because you will also have these issues when you're working with people, because they will transfer their trauma-formed ideas of what a relationship is onto you. So, if people are missing appointments, or they're saying one thing but doing another, or they're taking you wrong, this is often a trauma response, and you need to understand it so you can work with it instead of becoming shut down yourself, or angry, or giving up. We finish with neurobiological safety and why we have to work within this frame initially. We can't just go in and say, right, you've got trauma, let's sort it out. You have to make the person feel really, really safe. And that's not an easy thing. It has to be done through certain techniques of calming, touch, sight and sound. It has to be a sensory experience of grounding in the here and now. Because remember, people who've had trauma tend to live back there then. Everything they do is as if it's happening back there then, when they were little and when things were overwhelming for them. I look at overcoming shame and the anxiety cycle, And I'll give you loads and loads of techniques, simple, most of them, very simple techniques, psychosensory techniques, most of them. In other words, they use the senses and psychology together to promote stabilization and recovery. And we look at the different phases through recovery. Because the idea really is to promote agency and resilience in your clients. It's not to allow them to become dependent on you to regulate their system. It's to teach them how to regulate their own system and thereby overcome their symptoms, because their symptoms are simply their body's way of telling themselves that something is imbalanced and wrong. So modern medicine, with its focus on symptoms, often misses the point entirely. So this trauma-informed view will totally shake up any idea you had of health and well-being. I certainly hope so. That's my aim. Sign up now. The link is below. Thank you for listening. See you then.